Have you ever built something so carefully, so completely that it became impossible to imagine it without you, only to watch it slip away in silence? I had. For nearly 3 decades, I devoted every hour, every calculated risk, every unspoken sacrifice to Roth Dominion Group, a logistics empire I built from a garage server and an aging fleet of box trucks. I didn't inherit legacy or luck. I earned every ounce of leverage we had in the market. Until one morning in March, sitting in a room of glass and power, I was told I was no longer the right fit for the company that bore my name. They said it, with polished smiles and practiced restraint. The kind of tone you use when firing someone you plan to name drop in your investor calls. And the man stepping into my seat? Lucian Vale, 34, trendy, charismatic, married to my co-founder's daughter, and the architect of our new future, apparently. As I listened, I didn't argue, I didn't plead. I just nodded once, folded the corner of my notes, and wondered quietly how long it would take before they realized what they'd done. It wouldn't take long. And by then, I wouldn't be watching. I'd be moving. It's strange how success rewrites memory. People forget the late nights and second mortgages, the rejections and doubts. They remember headlines and market caps. But the real story of Roth Dominion began long before its logo adorned cargo planes and satellite dashboards. It started in 1995, in a rented storage unit on the outskirts of Newark, where I mapped out delivery routes with a mechanical pencil and a laminated highway atlas. Back then I was just Julian Roth, an ex-commodities trader who had seen enough inefficiency in global supply chains to bet everything on a better system. And when I say everything, I mean it. My apartment, my savings, and even my late father's watch, which I pawned to meet our first payroll. I didn't build an empire alone. I built it with people who believed. Drivers who trusted my word more than their contracts, clients who took a chance when we had nothing but a plan, and vendors who understood that a handshake from Julian meant payment would always come, even if I had to wire it from my personal account. By 2010, Roth Dominion was moving precision pharmaceuticals across 5 continents. During the outbreak in 2014, we became the silent arm behind emergency medical deliveries in West Africa, coordinating complex, high-risk transport networks through regions most companies wouldn't touch. We didn't make noise. We made it work. That became our brand, Invisible Precision. After the hurricane season of 2017 devastated the Gulf, we were the first company with drivers on the ground, clearing routes and hand-delivering insulin to rural clinics. When the pandemic hit, in 2020 we mobilized in less than 72 hours. While other companies scrambled for headlines, we delivered ventilators at cost to hospitals we knew couldn't afford delays. I slept 4 hours a night, 8 standing up, and for 12 straight months, didn't step inside my own home. I still remember the voicemail I got from a hospital director in Jackson, Mississippi. He said, "Julian, you didn't just deliver equipment, you delivered time we didn't have. It wasn't about legacy, it was about leverage, the kind that's built on trust, not margin." That's why I never worried about the suits upstairs. We had a board, sure. They liked charts and capital efficiency. They liked Lucian, too. He wore sharp suits, understood social metrics, and had a vision for digitally disruptive fulfillment. I welcomed him at first, coached him even, gave him access to our ops center, introduced him to suppliers. He listened politely, took notes on his phone, and asked all the right questions. But something always felt off. He spoke in phrases like brand velocity and streamlining emotional friction. He understood commerce, not consequences. Still, I kept showing up. Because to me, loyalty wasn't conditional. Then things shifted. First, it was an investor meeting I wasn't invited to. Then procurement decisions started bypassing my desk. And when our largest East Coast client asked for me personally during a review, Lucian told them I was transitioning into an advisory role. The warning signs were there. I just chose not to read them. Or maybe I did, and chose not to believe them. Because when you build something from the dirt, you assume it will always recognize your hands. You assume the people in the tower see what you see from the ground, but they don't. And one day you walk into a boardroom to find your chair already occupied. your title already reassigned, and your legacy rebranded as a stepping stone for someone else's ambition. The question wasn't why it happened, it was what I was going to do about it. And that answer was already forming, quietly, methodically, in the back of my mind. The morning they made it official was unusually quiet. No pre-meeting chatter, no idle laughter. Just the sound of phones being silenced and chairs adjusting around the conference table. I remember watching Lucian enter last, unhurried, flawless as always in a tailored navy suit, his wedding band catching the sunlight as he adjusted his cuff. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. His eyes were already on the future, and in that version I didn't exist. The board chair cleared his throat and launched into a prepared statement. Phrases like strategic repositioning and agile leadership floated across the room like incense. The air was thick with staged sincerity. I waited, silent, letting them get through the performance. At some point, the phrase redefining, the face of operational excellence, was used. That was my cue. Lucian leaned forward then, voice warm, rehearsed, professional. Julian has been instrumental in shaping this company's foundation, he said. And now we're entering a new phase. With technologies evolving and global markets demanding faster, leaner models, this is the right time to shift leadership dynamics. I nodded slowly, as if I needed a moment to absorb the poetry of my own dismissal. In truth, I wasn't angry. I was fascinated. This was the part where they thought they were taking something from me. But what they didn't understand, what Lucian especially didn't understand, was that empires built on metrics collapse when the humans behind them walk away. What struck me most wasn't the betrayal. It was the cleanliness of it. The press release was already drafted. The new role for me, chair emeritus or some nonsense, had already been agreed upon. They would announce it as a mutual decision, a graceful transition. I would be applauded for my contributions, thanked for my service, and then politely escorted out of relevance. They thought I'd cling to the edge of the table. Instead, I stood. I looked each board member in the eye, not with resentment, but with a quiet kind of pity, because I knew something none of them did yet. They had just handed the keys of a finely tuned machine to a man who thought logistics was just a series of clicks and trucks. A man who had never lost sleep over a late delivery to a children's hospital, or driven overnight to fix a shipment error because the numbers weren't just numbers, they were lives. As I left the room, no one followed. No one said my name. But, as the elevator doors closed, I reached into my coat pocket and felt something sharp. A small white business card with embossed lettering, one I hadn't thought about in months. There was a name on it. Alana Chen. The gesture had seemed polite at the time, even ceremonial, but now it felt deliberate. The moment the doors opened, I walked out, not like a man who'd been pushed out of power, but like one who had just remembered exactly where it lived. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I walked, something I hadn't done in years, without purpose or destination. The streets of Midtown felt foreign, like a city I used to own but no longer belonged to. Towering billboards flashed headlines I'd once been a part of. Now I was just another man in a suit, untethered and invisible. By the time I reached my penthouse, the press release had already gone out. My inbox was full of polite congratulations. A new chapter, some wrote. Much deserved rest. A few even dared to call it an elegant transition. I didn't respond to any of them. I stood by the window and looked out over the skyline, the city bathed in a golden, disinterested light. For the first time in years, I had nothing in front of me. No meetings, no fires to put out, no boardrooms to navigate. And the silence at first felt like a failure echoing. I walked into my study, a room more symbolic than used. On the shelf, nestled between first edition business books and framed letters from governors and CEOs, was a silver frame. In it, a photo of my team during our first international delivery, grinning, dusty, triumphant. Tucked behind the glass was something I'd nearly forgotten, the business card, Alana Chen. She'd handed it to me 2 years ago after a logistics summit in Singapore. At the time, Novachem was expanding aggressively in Southeast Asia, and Alana had spoken on a panel about building ethical supply chains in volatile markets. We spoke briefly after the event. Nothing transactional, no sales pitch, just mutual respect. Before we parted, she handed me her card and said almost offhandedly, "If they ever forget who made them possible, call me." I hadn't thought about that moment in months. But now, holding the card, it felt like a door I hadn't realized was waiting to open. There was something about the timing. The calm that had followed the chaos wasn't grief, it was clarity. I wasn't mourning a company. I was letting go of an illusion that they had the power to define me, to erase me. They had removed me from the room, but they had forgotten. I had built the room, and I still had the blueprint. The next morning, I dialed the number on Alana's card before I could talk myself out of it. It rang twice before a calm, deliberate voice answered. "Julian Roth," she said. "I was wondering when you'd call." That was the kind of greeting that made it clear this wasn't just a courtesy. She had been waiting, not out of pity, but preparation. We met that evening at a private dining room inside the Rosemont Club, a quiet hideaway favored by people who like to move influence without advertising it. Alana arrived early. She was as precise as I remembered. No wasted words, no ornamental talk. A folder rested in front of her, closed but clearly important. "I read the press release," she said once we were seated. "I assume most of it was fiction, polished fiction," I replied. "The kind that investors like." She nodded. "Then let's talk about facts." Novachem had been quietly developing a next-generation pharmaceutical distribution model, one that relied not on bulk warehousing and bloated routes but hyper-responsive modular supply systems. Think emergency response meets predictive logistics, and they needed someone to build the infrastructure. "I can hire someone with a resume," Alana said. "Or I can partner with someone who already knows where the real power in this industry lies in relationships, not metrics." She slid the folder toward me. Inside, a draft proposal. Novachem would launch a separate division, privately funded, quietly structured. I wouldn't just be consulting, I'd be a silent co-founder, leading the build from the inside out. Full operational control, significant equity, a clean slate. She paused before speaking again. "We've spoken to 3 of your former top clients, off the record. They're waiting. They stayed with Roth Dominion because of you, not because of your replacement. One even said, 'If Julian ever stands something else up, we're following him.' It was tempting, but I'd spent too long building Roth Dominion to abandon caution for flattery." "What's your timeline?" I asked. "Discretion is important, but speed is vital," she said. "Our board has approved the initial fund. We can move as soon as you say yes, but Julian, this isn't about revenge. This is about building what comes next." I looked down at the final page. A simple title. Links Integrated Logistics. The name was clean, agile, precise. It didn't feel like a rebound. It felt like evolution. I didn't give her an answer that night. I took the folder home, laid it on my desk, and stared at it long past midnight. But deep down, the decision had already been made. They had erased my name from the masthead. Now, I would erase their illusion of control from the market, and this time I wouldn't be alone. I would bring the ones who remembered, the ones who built the foundation and were waiting, quietly, patiently, for the call to build again. By the end of that week, I'd stopped referring to links as a proposal. It had become a living thing, something lean and quiet and already in motion. I made 5 calls. Not to headhunters, not to board members, but to the people who still knew how to move freight in a thunderstorm, how to reroute cross-border shipments without a spreadsheet, how to keep a truck running in sub-zero conditions with a socket wrench and tape. They didn't ask questions. They just said, when and where. I leased a floor in a converted textile mill in Red Hook, Brooklyn, far from the polished towers and investor lounges. The space was raw, exposed beams and concrete, with the hum of cargo ships drifting in from the docks. We set up folding tables, whiteboards, and secured servers with military-grade encryption. It looked nothing like Roth Dominion. That was the point. We called it the lab. Our first task: rebuild the human infrastructure. Lynx wouldn't be about drones or vanity tech. It would be about responsiveness, trust, and relationships, powered by smart systems but guided by experienced hands. I brought in 2 former ops directors I'd worked with years ago, a brilliant systems engineer from Tel Aviv, and a woman named Mira, who had been laid off by Roth Dominion during Lucian's first cost-cutting initiative. She was 6 months pregnant when she got the call. I remembered because I'd personally intervened to extend her severance. She ran our field coordination like a maestro. Meanwhile, Lucian was busy making headlines. He launched a flashy initiative called Supply Sync, an AI automated routing system that promised 22% efficiency gains through predictive analytics. The board was euphoric, the media loved it. Clients, not so much. Delays increased, customer service was routed through bots that couldn't understand urgency. And worst of all, Lucian had gutted the very teams that once fixed problems before they escalated. One of our first pilot contracts came through a quiet back channel, a major oncology research facility in Chicago that had relied on us for time-sensitive, genetic material deliveries. They were unimpressed by Supply Sync's generic routing. We didn't advertise links. We just delivered, on time, flawlessly, twice. That was all it took. Word spread. Other former clients reached out, quietly, cautiously, like birds returning to a branch they thought had been cut. We didn't promise miracles. We simply showed them what reliable felt like. At night I reviewed maps, contracts, and dashboards, but my thoughts always returned to something Alana had said over dinner. This isn't about revenge. It's about building what comes next. Still, I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something else too. Not anger, not even pride, but a kind of measured resolve. I wasn't here to punish Roth Dominion. I was here to remind them what they had thrown away. And I wasn't doing it with a press tour or public speeches. I was doing it the way I'd always built, quietly, with precision, through people who still believed in service over spectacle. In one of our early planning meetings, someone joked that Lynx wasn't a logistics company. It was an insurgency. I didn't laugh. They weren't wrong. We weren't here to compete. We were here to outlast, and it had already begun. By the end of the second quarter, the cracks in Roth Dominion were no longer hairline. They were spreading like fractures through glass. It began with the Novachem account. Alana waited for the contract's renewal window, then sent a concise, formal notice. Novachem would not be extending their logistics agreement. No explanation offered, none required. By the time it reached Lucian's desk, the decision was irreversible. He tried to recover, of course, flew out to their San Diego headquarters, requested a strategic alignment meeting. Alana didn't take it. She sent her deputy instead, with a message. We've aligned elsewhere. What followed was a slow but public unraveling. Roth Dominion stock took an immediate 9% dip after the Novachem news leaked to the analyst circuit. But worse than the financial hit was the ripple effect. 2 other high-profile clients, both healthcare networks, quietly pulled their contracts within weeks. The message was clear: if Novachem was out, others would follow. Behind the scenes, Lucian was scrambling. He reinstated several department heads he'd previously dismissed, tried to walk back AI-only implementation, and even reached out to some of my former contacts. The irony wasn't lost on me. These were people he had once overlooked, now being summoned to clean up a mess dressed in innovation. Meanwhile, Lynx remained deliberately invisible. We didn't run ads. We didn't leak stories to the press. But clients kept coming, one contract at a time, each vetted for integrity and long-term alignment. Our servers tracked every route down to the minute. And our drivers, many of them people who'd been displaced during Lucian's restructuring, performed like professionals with something to prove. I watched from a distance as Roth Dominion's leadership issued internal memos urging patience and confidence. They spun the client exits as natural churn. But inside, Panic had set in. One former colleague told me off the record that Lucian had started holding twice-daily crisis meetings. Morale plummeted. Contractors were unpaid. Rumors of a pending acquisition swirled. Still, I stayed quiet. One morning, I received a call from a journalist at the Financial Herald. He asked if I had any comment on Roth Dominion's market instability. I said no. Let the story write itself, because here's what no one at Roth Dominion seemed to grasp. Reputations are earned in silence and lost in headlines. And by the time the board realized it wasn't just one lost contract, it was an exodus, it was too late. What they thought was a pivot had become a free fall, and we weren't even close to finished. 3 months later, I walked into the Linux Manhattan office to find a copy of Forbes waiting on my desk. My assistant had left it open to a feature story titled, "The Man Who Rebuilt Logistics from the Shadows." My face wasn't on the cover, and that suited me. The photo they used was a shot of our control center, wide angle, clean, efficient. Real work, not theater. The story had made the rounds before lunch. Calls poured in. Venture firms, government agencies, even 2 legacy competitors who wanted to explore strategic partnerships. But I didn't answer any of them. That day, I had somewhere else to be. At 3:00 p.m., I returned to a building I hadn't seen in nearly a year. Roth Dominion's headquarters. Not for nostalgia, not for ego. I was there to meet Jacob Mason, a junior logistics manager I had mentored years ago. Now interim COO. Young, principled, steady under pressure, he was the one putting out fires while Lucian scrambled for cover. We met in a quiet conference room on the 15th floor. Jacob looked tired but resolute. "Mr. Roth," he said, shaking my hand. "Thank you for coming." "I'm not here for a reunion," I said. "Let's talk about the subcontracting agreement." Roth Dominion, having lost over 60% of its key accounts, was trying to survive by becoming a regional fulfillment vendor. They needed work, and we needed overflow partners for less sensitive routes. It was business, nothing more. I offered fair terms, no discounts, no favors. They accepted. As I was leaving, Jacob asked me a quiet question. "Do you ever think it could have gone differently?" I paused, then nodded. Yes, but only if they'd understood the difference between leading a company and owning it. Didn't see Lucian that day. I didn't need to. Word had it he'd resigned 2 weeks earlier, citing personal realignment. Last I heard, he was heading up a lifestyle tech brand funded by his father-in-law. No mention of logistics in the press release. On my way out, I passed the floor where my old office had been. The nameplate was gone. The hallway was quiet. A company trying to remember how it used to work. Back at Linux, I walked through our floor. As drivers prepped their schedules and dispatch leads ran their evening briefings, no fanfare. Just people doing the job with care and competence. The kind of place where results mattered more than roles. That evening, I stood by the window of my office, looking out over a skyline that no longer intimidated me. I had returned, not to prove them wrong, but to prove we were never obsolete, only underestimated. I didn't take back what was mine. I built what came next. In the months that followed, Lynx didn't just grow, it matured. We weren't chasing headlines or quarterly spikes. We were building muscle, refining systems, expanding our presence into 3 new states, onboarding clients who valued substance over spectacle. But somewhere along the way, I realized the goal had shifted. Success wasn't the finish line. It was the foundation. And legacy, as it turns out, isn't measured in equity or market share. It's measured in what you leave behind that doesn't need your name to stand. That's why, one quiet morning over coffee, I made a decision. We would launch the Lynx Fellowship, a leadership program for displaced logistics professionals, veterans, laid-off drivers, small operators absorbed by megacorps. It wouldn't be about teaching software or spreadsheets. It would be about judgment, grit, human instinct. The things I saw vanish the moment Roth Dominion chased scale over soul. The first class had 12 fellows, among them, A woman who once ran emergency routing for a hurricane relief team, a former union rep who had been blacklisted after speaking up, and a 22-year-old coder who'd left her Silicon Valley job because she wanted to build things that actually moved. Every Friday I sat in on the sessions, not to lecture but to listen, and every time someone spoke about why they were here, not just for work but for purpose, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not in what I'd built, but in who was building it now. Because the truth is, I was never building a company. I was building a standard that no matter how far technology advanced, trust would still matter. Experience would still matter. The driver on the back road, the coordinator watching the weather change, the analyst who saw a delay not as a statistic but as a human disruption. That's what kept the world turning. I was no longer fighting for a seat at someone else's table. We were building our own. And this time, no one would forget where the legs came from. This story isn't just about a man reclaiming his dignity. It's about how easily systems forget the people who built them. Julian Roth wasn't outpaced, he was outpositioned. Not because he lacked skill, but because the people in charge stopped valuing the kind of leadership that doesn't trend. On social media, quiet consistency, earned trust, long-game thinking. We live in a time where disruption is a badge of honor. But what we often fail to ask is, disrupting what and at whose expense? Julian's story reminds us that experience isn't dead weight. It's the foundation. Relationships, reputation, and resilience don't always fit into quarterly reports. But when the system breaks, they're the first things we reach for. And maybe you've seen that in your own world. A good leader pushed aside, or a steady hand replaced by a louder one. If so, drop it in the comments. You never know who needs to hear they're not alone. And if stories like this speak to something in you, feel free to stay with us. The next one might be closer to your life than you expect. Because around here, we don't just tell stories. We remember the ones worth listening to.